Clear the room. Now, whatever you're doing, do it somewhere else. We've got a board meeting in 12 minutes, and there are not supposed to be civilians on this floor at this hour. Garrett Sinclair did not bother to register her face. He was already moving across the executive lounge of Ashcroft Capital. He moved with the brisk efficiency of a man who had spent 31 years assuming every room he entered was his to direct. He gestured vaguely at the coffee station, at the silver tray of pastries on the credenza, at the leather chairs angled toward the window. The way a stage manager gestures at props that need to be struck before the next scene. Catering should have been out of here by 9:15, he said, more to himself than to her. I told Sandra. Every quarter I tell Sandra. 2 hours before a board introduction. No exceptions. No overlap. No outside personnel in this room. He stopped near the credenza. He looked at her finally. Properly. He registered the navy suit, the simple gold earrings, the brown leather portfolio resting against her hip. His brain ran the calculation it had been running for 3 decades. It got the answer wrong. Are you with the catering company, or are you here from the building? He asked. His voice carried the particular impatience of a man who could not conceive of a third option. Either way, I need you out of this room in the next 90 seconds. Please. Imani Adeyemi stood by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Lake Michigan. She did not move. She watched Garrett Sinclair lift the silver coffee pot. She watched him frown at it as if its existence offended him personally. She watched him set it back down with a soft, irritated clink. She watched his shoulders, broad and slightly stooped under a charcoal 3-piece suit. A suit that had cost more than her mother had earned in 5 months of overnight shifts at the hospital cafeteria in 2004. She watched the gold band of his watch catch the morning light as he moved. She did not speak. She did not reach for her badge. She did not reach for her phone. She did not reach for any of the documents in the portfolio tucked under her arm. She watched a young woman in a black catering uniform freeze near the service door. She watched the young woman look from Garrett to Imani. She watched her quietly retreat into the corridor, without making eye contact with either of them. She watched the door swing closed behind her, and she understood with the perfect clarity that came from years of being misread in rooms like this one, that the catering staff had just chosen, in the space of 4 seconds, to leave a black woman alone with a man who had decided who she was before she had spoken a single word. "Did you hear me?" Garrett said. He had turned fully toward her now. His face had the expression of a man beginning to wonder whether the woman in front of him was entirely present. "I said I need this room cleared. I am not going to ask a third time." Imani moved. She did not argue. She did not smile. She did not reach for her badge or pull a card from her portfolio. She did not do any of the small, dignifying things a woman with options might have done in that moment to correct the record. She lifted the small espresso cup she had set on the windowsill 2 minutes earlier. She gave Garrett Sinclair a polite, almost imperceptible nod, and she walked out of the executive lounge without saying a single word. Garrett watched her go. He waited until the door clicked shut behind her. Then he exhaled. He ran a hand through his thinning silver hair. He muttered to no one in particular, "Christ, what is wrong with this floor today?" He did not know. Because Garrett Sinclair had never in his life had a reason to know. That the woman who had just walked out of his executive lounge was the only reason there was a meeting on the calendar that morning. He did not know that her name was printed on the first page of every document that would be distributed at the board table in 9 minutes. He did not know that her photograph was already loaded into the introduction slide. The slide that would project onto the screen at the head of the conference room at exactly 10:02 in the morning. He did not know that in 13 minutes, the same woman he had just dismissed without once making proper eye contact would walk back through that boardroom door. At the head of a 4-person executive transition team from Meridian Equity Partners, that she would carry under her arm the executed acquisition agreement. The agreement that, 11 days earlier, had transferred majority control of Ashcroft Capital from its founding family into Meridian's portfolio. He did not know that she had been selected 6 weeks ago, by unanimous vote of Meridian's executive committee, to serve as the new acquisition CEO of Ashcroft Capital. He did not know that the board meeting he had told her to clear out of was the meeting in which she would be formally introduced to him as the woman he would, for the rest of his employment at this firm, be reporting to. He did not know any of it. He had 11 minutes left to find out. To understand why what happened in that executive lounge mattered, you have to understand who Imani Adeyemi actually is. Not the woman Garrett Sinclair invented in the 4 seconds it took him to glance at her suit and decide she had wandered onto the wrong floor. The real one. Imani grew up in Ensley, on the west side of Birmingham, Alabama, in a small brick house on a street where every other porch light burned out in the summer. Nobody on the block could afford to keep them all lit at the same time. Her father, Marcus Adeyemi, was a postal carrier for the United States Postal Service. He walked the same 6-mile route for 27 years, through neighborhoods the city had stopped resurfacing in 1989. He came home most evenings with his feet swollen inside his regulation black shoes. He sat on the front step to unlace them slowly, because bending was harder than it used to be, and he ate dinner with a heating pad pressed against his lower back. Her mother, Loretta Adeyemi, worked the overnight shift in the cafeteria of UAB Medical Center. She packed meal trays for surgical patients from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, 5 nights a week, for 22 years. She came home with her shoes in her hand, because her feet hurt too much to wear them up the front steps. She slept until 1 in the afternoon, and she was always awake by the time the 3 children came home from school, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, ready to ask each of them what they had learned that day. Imani was the oldest of 3. Her 2 younger brothers, Caleb, now an emergency room nurse in Atlanta, and Joshua, a senior chief petty officer stationed in Norfolk. They had grown up inside the same household mathematics she had, a system where every dollar was counted twice before it was spent once, where new shoes for one child meant repaired shoes for the next, where the answer to "can we afford it" was almost always "not yet, baby," and the word "yet" was the only part of the sentence that mattered. She was 8 years old the first time she watched her mother count change on the kitchen table to figure out whether they had enough for the electric bill or the phone bill that month. She remembered, with the kind of clarity adult memory rarely affords, that her mother had not looked worried. She had looked focused, the way a surgeon looks focused before an operation, the way a soldier looks focused before a long march. There was no panic in her face, only the quiet, total concentration of a woman who had decided long ago that her children would not know they were being protected from anything until they were old enough to look back and recognize it. Imani was 10 the first time a teacher told her she was articulate, in the particular tone of voice that meant the teacher had not expected her to be. She was 12 when she stopped correcting people who mispronounced her name. She was 14 when she stopped letting them. She graduated valedictorian of a H. Parker High School in 2002, the year her father missed her ceremony because the Postal Service refused to grant him the day off, and her mother sat alone in the 3rd row and cried so quietly nobody around her noticed. She went to Spelman College in Atlanta on a combination of academic scholarships and Pell Grants, where she discovered 3 things in rapid succession during her freshman year: that she loved finance, that she was very good at it, and that the world of finance had been structured in such a way that the people most likely to need its tools had been most systematically excluded from learning how to use them. She graduated from Spelman summa cum laude in 2006. She accepted an analyst position at Goldman Sachs in New York, where she spent the next 3 years learning how money moved through institutions designed by men whose grandfathers had built those institutions. She left Goldman in 2009 for Wharton, where she earned her MBA in 2011, with a concentration in mergers, acquisitions, and post-transaction operations. She wrote her capstone thesis on what she called extraction acquisitions, the pattern of private equity buyouts that systematically stripped acquired companies of their workforce, their pension obligations, and their community footprint within 36 months of closing. Her thesis advisor told her it was too narrow a topic to build a career around. He told her she should focus on broader strategy. She thanked him politely. She kept the thesis. She kept the data. She kept, most importantly, the conviction that there was another way to buy a company than the one she was being trained to execute. She did not yet know it, but in 7 years that conviction would put her in a corner office at one of the largest equity firms in the country. And in another 4 it would put her standing at a window above Lake Michigan, watching a man fail to see her. The path from Wharton to that morning in Chicago was not a straight line. It almost never is. For women like Imani Adeyemi, the line bent. It doubled back on itself. It paused for entire fiscal quarters in places nobody at Spelman or Wharton had told her she would have to stop. But the destination, when she finally arrived at it, was a destination she had selected herself. She spent her first 2 years out of Wharton at Bain & Company, in their Chicago office, where she learned the deeply useful and frequently humbling skill of telling Fortune 500 CEOs things they did not want to hear, in language polished enough that they would actually listen. She did good work. She made partner track at 28. And she discovered, somewhere during her 7th strategy engagement for a multinational that had quietly laid off 4,000 workers 6 months after she had signed off on a restructuring framework, that consulting was not the building she actually wanted to be inside of. She left Bain in 2013 for Carrington Strategic Partners, a mid-tier private equity firm headquartered in Chicago, with offices in Atlanta and New York. She joined as a vice president in their value creation group, which was the polite institutional name for the team responsible for figuring out how to make money on the companies the firm had just bought. She spent her first 18 months at Carrington doing exactly what she had been hired to do, and watching, in painful detail, the same patterns of extraction she had documented in her Wharton thesis play out in real time, in real factories, real call centers, real warehouses across the Midwest. In 2015, she went to the partners with a proposal. She wanted to run one of the firm's own portfolio companies, not as a board member, not as an advisor. As the operating CEO, she had identified a company in Memphis, a third-generation family-owned cold storage logistics firm called Haverson Freight. Carrington had purchased the firm 6 months earlier and was struggling to integrate it. The previous CEO had been pushed out in a manner the local press had described, accurately, as brutal. Morale was in free fall. 2 of the company's 3 largest clients were threatening to walk. Imani told the partners she could turn it around in 18 months. She would not lay off a single hourly worker. She would not relocate the headquarters. She would not strip the pension fund. The company could be profitable again on the original capital structure, she said, if it was run by someone who actually believed it was worth saving. The partners did not believe her. They gave her the job anyway, in part because nobody else wanted it, and in part because 2 of them had quietly concluded that letting Imani fail in Memphis would be a useful lesson she clearly needed before she made partner. She did not fail. Haverson Freight returned to profitability in 14 months. By month 22, the company had won back both of the clients who had threatened to leave. It had signed 2 new ones, and it had posted its strongest revenue quarter in 11 years. Imani spent 41 weeks of her first 18 months physically inside the company's warehouses and dispatch offices in Memphis, learning the names of every shift supervisor, every driver with more than 10 years of tenure. She raised the floor wage by $4 an hour. She absorbed the cost by restructuring the executive bonus tier. The partners at Carrington took notice. They gave her another company in 2017, a specialty parts manufacturer in Pittsburgh. She turned that one around in 11 months. They gave her a third in 2019, a small community bank holding group with 12 branches across the Carolinas. She turned that one around in 9. By 2021, Imani Adeyemi had become, quietly and almost without industry attention, one of the most reliable post-acquisition operators in American private equity. A perfect record across 3 turnarounds, not a single hourly employee laid off in any of them. Combined revenue grown by 31%. And more importantly than any of that, a reputation among the workers in those companies as the kind of new owner who showed up, learned your name, and remembered it the next time she came through. In 2022, Meridian Equity Partners came calling, an $80 billion firm headquartered in Manhattan. Their executive committee had spent 6 months building a new internal practice they were calling acquisition leadership. They wanted to do something nobody else in their tier was doing: install operators rather than financiers as CEOs of newly acquired companies. They wanted to prove that humane acquisitions could outperform extractive ones on a 5-year horizon. They needed a managing director to run the practice. They wanted Imani. She took the meeting. She took the offer. She did not, that morning in 2022 when she signed her contract with Meridian, imagine that 3 years later the work would land her in front of a window above Lake Michigan, watching a man who could not see her tell her to clear his room. The acquisition of Ashcroft Capital had closed 9 days earlier, on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, in a wire transfer that moved $410 million from a custodial account in New York to an escrow account in Chicago, in the time it took Imani to drink half a cup of coffee in her hotel room. Ashcroft Capital was, by every external measure, a quiet success story. The firm had been founded in 1962 by Whitman Ashcroft, a Northwestern law graduate who had walked out of his job at a regional bank in his 30s, with a small client list and a conviction that wealthy families in the Midwest deserved the same caliber of investment advisory service as wealthy families on the coasts. He had built the firm carefully over 4 decades. He had handed it to his son in 2003. His son, never quite his father, had presided over 12 years of cautious expansion. And the slow erosion of internal accountability that always happens when a founder's child is allowed to run something he did not have to build. By 2024, the firm managed $4.8 billion in client assets. It employed 312 people across offices in Chicago, Minneapolis, and St. Louis. It generated $94 million in annual revenue, with operating margins that had been declining at roughly 70 basis points a year for 6 years running. The Ashcroft family had quietly put the firm on the market in early 2025 because Whitman's son, now 68, wanted to retire to his lake house in Wisconsin, and the next generation, Trey Ashcroft III, 29 years old and currently sitting on the firm's board in a non-executive role, had declined the opportunity to take over, with a frankness his grandfather would have respected. Meridian had been one of 4 firms to bid. Their offer had not been the highest. It had, however, been the only offer that included a binding commitment to retain the existing workforce through at least the first 36 months following the close. Whitman Ashcroft, who was now 88 years old and in declining health, had reportedly told his son that he did not care which firm paid the most. He cared which firm would treat the people who had built this thing for him with something resembling respect. The board signed the term sheet on a Thursday. The wire cleared 11 business days later. Imani Adeyemi was named the firm's incoming chief executive officer, in a confidential resolution circulated to Ashcroft's senior leadership team 3 days after that. Or rather, it should have been circulated. The resolution had been drafted by Meridian's general counsel. It had been transmitted to Ashcroft's general counsel, Robert Tennant, and it had been queued for distribution to the senior leadership in advance of the introduction meeting on Tuesday morning. The plan had been straightforward. Senior leadership would receive the resolution Friday afternoon. They would have the weekend to absorb the news. They would arrive Tuesday morning prepared to meet their new CEO. Robert Tennant had decided, for reasons he would later be required to explain in writing, not to distribute the resolution as instructed. He had not informed anyone of this decision. He had simply held the document in his office and assumed, in the particular assumption of a man who had spent 23 years at Ashcroft and had grown comfortable with his place in its hierarchy, that the announcement could wait until Garrett Sinclair was personally present to manage the room when it was made. Garrett Sinclair, in other words, did not know who his new boss was that morning. Because his old colleague had decided, he did not need to know yet. Imani had been informed of this small procedural failure 40 minutes before her flight landed at O'Hare on Monday evening. Adrian Chen, her chief of staff at Meridian, had called her from a Manhattan office at 6:43 in the evening. She had explained in the careful neutral tone Adrian used when she was delivering news she knew Imani would have feelings about, that Ashcroft's general counsel had not transmitted the resolution as instructed, and that the senior leadership at Ashcroft would therefore be walking into Tuesday's introduction meeting, completely unaware of who they were about to meet. Imani had listened. She had thanked Adrian. She had asked one question. Was anyone informed? No, Adrian said. Not at the senior level. Tennant kept it tight. Then we don't tell them tonight, Imani had said. We let the room be the room. I want to see who they are when they don't know I'm watching. Now, 14 hours later, in a quiet hallway on the 42nd floor of the Ashcroft Tower, Imani Adeyemi walked slowly toward the elevator bank, with a cooling espresso cup in her hand. 11 minutes until the meeting. She had not survived 20 years in this business by being surprised when men like Garrett Sinclair revealed themselves. She had learned long ago that what a person did when they thought nobody important was watching was almost always the most reliable data you could collect about them. Garrett had just given her his data. She had 11 minutes to decide what to do with it. What Imani did with those 11 minutes mattered less than what she did not do. She did not call Adrian. She did not text her legal team. She did not return to the lobby to wait until the meeting began. She did not, even for a moment, allow herself the small private rehearsal of indignation that would have been entirely defensible under the circumstances. She walked the long way around the 42nd floor, past the wall of framed portraits of Ashcroft Capital's founding partners, past the conference rooms with their glass walls and their carefully lit credenzas, past a hallway lined with the names of every employee who had been with the firm for more than 20 years etched into a brass plaque. She stopped in front of the plaque for 40 seconds, reading. She made a small note in her head about 3 of the names she would ask about by the end of the week, names belonging to people she would meet by the end of the month. She finished her espresso. She set the empty cup on a credenza in the hallway. She walked into the women's restroom on the south side of the floor. She ran cold water over her hands for the length of one slow breath, and she looked at herself in the mirror. The face that looked back at her was the face her grandmother had looked at her with at every graduation, at every funeral, at every quiet kitchen table conversation that had ever mattered. It was the face her mother had given her a single piece of advice about. On a Sunday afternoon in 2007, the week before Imani had left Birmingham for New York. Don't ever rush them, baby. Let them tell you who they are. Then you decide what you want to do with that. Imani dried her hands. She straightened the cuffs of her navy blazer. She picked up her portfolio from the counter. She walked out of the restroom, and she turned toward the executive boardroom at the end of the hall, where the meeting that bore her name on its agenda had now been scheduled to begin in 7 minutes. Inside Boardroom A, Garrett Sinclair was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table. In the chair he had occupied at every senior leadership meeting at Ashcroft Capital since 2018. He was scrolling through an email on his phone, with the slightly impatient absorption of a man who had not yet decided whether the morning's incoming traffic was worth answering. 3 other executives sat around the table. To his right was Robert Tennant, the firm's general counsel, 58 years old, a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School, 23 years at Ashcroft, married to his college sweetheart, 2 children both at Northwestern. He was holding a paper coffee cup with both hands and pretending to read the agenda printed in front of him. He had not, in the previous 4 days, told a single colleague that the resolution nomming Ashcroft's new chief executive officer was currently sitting in a sealed envelope inside the top drawer of his office desk. He had told himself he was managing the announcement carefully. He had told himself it was a procedural courtesy to Garrett. The cup in his hands was shaking, very faintly, in a way that nobody in the room had yet noticed. Across from Tennant sat Jonas Whitmore, 54, the head of Wealth Advisory, and the executive most directly responsible for the relationships that generated 3/4 of the firm's revenue. Jonas was a careful man, a former tax attorney who had spent a decade and a half at Ashcroft after a long career at the IRS. He liked spreadsheets. He liked redundant verification. He had been reading the same paragraph of the agenda for the last 2 minutes, not because the paragraph was difficult, but because something about the morning had felt subtly off to him from the moment he had arrived, and he had not yet figured out what. At the far end of the table, 3 seats from anyone else, sat Marion Castillo, the firm's chief investment officer, 49 years old, a graduate of UCLA and then Stanford, the only woman on the executive committee. She was the daughter of a teacher from Sacramento and a roofer from Guadalajara, and she had spent 16 years at Ashcroft very carefully learning which version of herself this particular room preferred her to be. She had not yet looked up from her notebook. She was already, in some way she could not have articulated, preparing for something. The door opened. Garrett did not look up. Marion looked up first. She saw, framed in the doorway, the same woman Garrett had described to her 30 seconds earlier. In a dismissive aside about an interloper he had had to remove from the executive lounge. Marion's face did not change in any way that would have been visible to anyone else at the table, but her hand, resting on the spine of her notebook, paused. Behind Imani Adeyemi, 3 other people entered the boardroom. A woman in her late 30s carrying a laptop bag, a man in his 40s with a leather folio under his arm, and a younger woman holding a small stack of bound documents pressed against her chest. They closed the door behind them. They did not speak. They arranged themselves along the wall behind Imani, like a quiet, unannounced honor guard. Garrett still had not looked up. She did not need to step further into the room. The room came to her, slowly, in stages. The way recognition always arrives in a place where the assumptions have done too much of the heavy lifting. Marion was the first to fully register what was happening. Her gaze had not moved from Imani since the door opened. And the small adjustments in her posture, the straightening of her spine, the quiet placement of her pen on the table, the careful folding of her hands, were the adjustments of a woman who had recognized, in an instant, that the room she had been preparing for was not the room she was about to be in. Jonas Whitmore looked up next. He had been reading the same paragraph of the agenda for nearly 4 minutes by then. He looked at Imani. He looked at the 3 people standing behind her along the wall. He looked at the small embossed crest on the leather portfolio in her hand, Meridian Equity Partners, a crest he had seen on every wire confirmation and closing document that had crossed his desk in the past 6 weeks, and his lips parted very slightly, without producing any sound. Robert Tennant did not look up at all. He kept his eyes on the agenda. The shaking of the paper coffee cup between his hands had become visible to anyone watching for it. And Marian, sitting almost directly across from him, was watching for it. Garrett finally lifted his head from his phone. He saw her. His face went through a small, visible flicker of recognition. The recognition of the woman who had ignored his instruction to leave the executive lounge 9 minutes earlier. And his immediate response was the response he had been having to small affronts to his authority for 31 years. "You again," he said. He set his phone down on the table with a deliberate small click. "I don't know what part of this is a closed meeting was unclear, but I am going to be very plain with you this time. I need you to take your friends and leave. We have actual business to conduct in this room," and he checked his watch. 4 minutes. The three people behind Imani did not move. They did not look at Garrett. They were, in some quiet professional way that Garrett was not yet equipped to read, waiting. Imani moved. She walked, with the same calm she had displayed in the executive lounge, around the long mahogany table toward the empty chair at the head. The chair Garrett was sitting in. She did not touch him. She did not gesture at him. She set her portfolio down on the polished wood of the conference table directly in front of the screen at the head of the room, and she pulled out the chair to the immediate left of where Garrett was sitting. The chair that had, in every previous Ashcroft Capital senior leadership meeting for the past 14 months, been left empty in deference to the CEO position that the company had not officially filled. She sat down in it. Garrett's eyes followed her the entire way. His face, by this point, had moved past confusion into something approaching a kind of stunned procedural offense. "What are you doing?" he said. His voice had taken on the low, tight pitch of a man who genuinely could not believe what was happening in front of him. "Who let you in here?" "Robert." "Robert, who is this woman? Did you let her in?" Robert Tennant did not answer. He could not, at this particular moment, find the configuration of words that would allow him to answer. The woman who had come in behind Imani, Adrienne Chen, Imani's chief of staff, 38 years old, 14 years of operating experience between McKinsey, Apollo, and Meridian, and a black belt in second-degree institutional politeness, stepped forward from her place along the wall. She walked to the credenza beside the screen. She removed a small remote control from a drawer. She pressed a single button, and the screen behind Imani's chair illuminated. On the screen, in the official Ashcroft Capital corporate template, was the introduction slide that had been queued for this meeting since the previous Friday afternoon. The slide that Robert Tennant had reviewed and approved on Thursday morning, and then quietly declined to circulate to the executive team. The slide bore 3 lines of text, centered, in the firm's serif heading font. "Welcome, Imani Adeyemi, incoming Chief Executive Officer, Ashcroft Capital, effective immediately." Beneath the text was a high-resolution corporate photograph of the woman now sitting in the chair beside Garrett Sinclair. The boardroom got very, very quiet. Garrett's face did the thing it does when a man is being made to look at a piece of information he is hopping, with the last functional engine of his denial, will say something different the second time through. He looked at the screen. He looked at Imani. He looked at the screen again. He looked, finally, at Robert Tennant. Robert Tennant set his coffee cup down on the table. His hands, freed of the cup, did not know where to go. The seconds that followed were, for Garrett Sinclair, the longest seconds of his professional career. The color did not drain from his face in a single motion. It receded in stages. The way light leaves a room when a heavy curtain is pulled across a window. First it left his lips, then the small dome of skin between his eyebrows, then the soft folds beneath his eyes. By the time it reached his neck, his hands, which had been resting confidently on the arms of his chair only moments earlier, had begun to grip the polished wood very lightly, in a way he was not aware of and would not have been able to control if he had been. He was a man of considerable physical presence. He had spent 31 years using that presence the way men in his position used everything else. as an instrument of conviction, an unspoken argument for his correctness in every room he had ever walked into. The presence did not leave him. It simply, in that moment, stopped being useful. It became, instead, something he had to carry, like an oversized piece of luggage in a room that was suddenly too small to accommodate it. He looked at the screen one more time. He read the words very carefully. In the way men in his position read things when they are hopping, that careful reading will rearrange the sentence. It did not rearrange. He turned to face Imani. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. The apology that was forming inside him, even now, was an apology shaped by the assumption that an apology was going to be sufficient. He had not yet absorbed the deeper truth. The truth Imani had already absorbed for him, on his behalf, 11 minutes ago, that what had happened in the executive lounge was not the kind of thing an apology could be made to repair. "Mr. Sinclair," Imani said. She had not raised her voice. She did not need to. The room had been arranged, by the quiet fact of her presence in it, to listen to her at whatever volume she chose. "Before this morning, I had read your file. I had read your performance reviews. I had read the 86-page transition memorandum the Ashcroft board prepared for Meridian during due diligence. I knew, before I walked into this building, that you had been the operating spine of this firm for the past 14 months. And I came here today prepared to ask you to remain in your role through at least the first 18 months of the transition." She paused. She did not look away from his face. "I am not going to ask you to do that anymore." Garrett's mouth moved. No sound came out. "In the 11 minutes between when I first walked onto this floor and when I sat down at this table, you have demonstrated, more clearly than any quarterly report or written reference ever could, the precise nature of your fitness for senior leadership at a firm I now own. You assumed who I was based on what I looked like. You spoke to me in a manner I would not tolerate from any employee of this firm speaking to any other person who works in this building. And when given a calm, low-cost opportunity to correct your assumption, by looking at me, by asking my name, by extending the bare minimum of professional courtesy you would have automatically extended to a stranger in a different body, you elected twice not to take it." Garrett's hands lifted from the arms of the chair. He set them in his lap, where they did not know what to do with themselves. "I will be brief, Mr. Sinclair, because this morning is going to require all of our attention to repair. And I have no interest in extending the part of it that involves you. You will not be returning to this firm after today. HR will reach out by end of business with the terms of your separation, which will be reviewed by external counsel. Your access credentials will be deactivated within the hour. The 2 security officers in the hallway will accompany you to your office to collect your personal effects. You are not to access any company systems or shared drives during that process. Your company-issued laptop, phone, and badge are to be surrendered before you leave the floor." She turned, by a fraction of a degree, toward Robert Tennant. "Mr. Tennant," she said, "the same applies to you. We will get to the specific reasons in a moment. For now, I would ask that you remain in the room." Robert Tennant nodded once. He had been staring at the surface of the table for nearly 2 minutes. He had not yet found a reason to lift his eyes. She did not turn to Marion or Jonas yet. She did not address Adrian or the 2 other members of her Meridian team standing along the wall behind her. She let the silence sit in the room for another beat. The kind of silence that gives every person in it the chance to feel exactly how loud certain decisions can become, when they are made under the assumption that nobody important is listening. Outside the boardroom door, the soft footsteps of the Ashcroft Tower's 2 on-site security officers came to a quiet stop in the corridor. Adrian had texted them 3 minutes earlier from inside the room. They had not been told why they were being summoned. They had been told only that they would be needed. Imani turned her attention back to Robert Tennant. "Mr. Tennant, I would like you to take a moment to look at the screen behind me. I want to be sure we are both clear about what it shows." Robert Tennant lifted his eyes. He looked at the screen. He looked back at Imani. There was, in his face, the very specific terrible self-knowledge of a man who had already known what was on the screen, because he had personally approved it the previous Thursday. This slide, Imani said, was created on October 14th. It was reviewed and approved by you in your capacity as General Counsel on October 16th. It was queued for distribution to the senior leadership team on Friday, October 18th at 4 in the afternoon Central Time. Alongside the formal board resolution nomming me as the firm's incoming chief executive officer, both documents were transmitted to your office for circulation. Neither was circulated. She let that sit. There are only two possible explanations, Mr. Tennant. The first is that the documents were misfiled, lost, or otherwise mishandled, and you can produce a written record of the error within the next 10 minutes. The second is that you made a deliberate decision to withhold the documents from your colleagues, including from Mr. Sinclair, who had a professional and personal interest in knowing who his new boss was going to be before that person walked into his executive lounge this morning. I would like to hear which one it is. Tennant's jaw worked. Once. Then again. He did not answer for a long moment. The hum of the building's ventilation system was, for the first time anyone in the room could remember, audible. It was the second one, Robert Tennant said. His voice was quiet. He had, somewhere in the last 2 minutes, made the small private decision to stop lying. It was, in his particular career, a rare decision, and it would later be the one piece of his conduct that Imani would remember with anything resembling respect. I thought, he said, and his voice was still very quiet, that the news would land better if Garrett was in the room when it landed. I thought I was managing the announcement. I was not managing the announcement. I was protecting Garrett from what? From having to find out what you looked like before he had time to prepare his face. Imani did not respond to that immediately. The honesty of the answer was not in any way exculpatory, but it had cost him something to say it, and she was professional enough to acknowledge the cost, even as she proceeded to act on it. Thank you for that answer, Mr. Tennant. It does not change the outcome, but it makes the documentation simpler. You will be terminated for cause. HR will be in touch. He nodded once. He did not argue. Imani turned finally to Marian Castillo. Marian had been very still for the last 6 minutes. She had not made a single sound. She had also, in some interior calibration she had been performing since approximately the age of 26, not allowed her face to communicate anything that might be read by the men in the room as either solidarity or judgment. Ms. Castillo, ma'am, you came into this room this morning prepared for a meeting you were not given the agenda for. You have been the firm's chief investment officer for 11 years. Your portfolio outperformed Ashcroft's benchmark by an average of 240 basis points for each of the last 6 years, in a market environment that did not flatter the rest of the firm's strategy. I have read every quarterly memo you have written since 2019. And I have noticed, as I suspect very few people in this building have noticed, that you have raised the same 3 structural concerns about the firm's risk concentration in each of the last 14 quarterly memos, and that none of those concerns have been addressed by anyone above you. Marian's mouth opened slightly. She closed it. I would like to be the person who addresses them, Ms. Castillo. I would like to meet with you tomorrow at 9 in the morning to begin that conversation. Are you available? Yes, ma'am. Thank you, I will see you then. She turned to Jonas Whitmore. Jonas had folded his hands on the table. His face was, for the first time that morning, fully present in the room. Mr. Whitmore, the relationships you manage account for 73% of this firm's revenue. I would like to keep them, and I would like to keep you. Tomorrow at 11, please. Whenever you are ready, Ms. Adeyemi. Imani nodded once to Adrian. Adrian walked to the door and opened it. 2 security officers in dark blue uniforms stepped quietly into the room. They did not approach the table. They simply waited at the threshold, the way professionals wait when they have already understood, without needing to be told, exactly what their role in the next 10 minutes was going to be. The exit of Garrett Sinclair from Ashcroft Capital took exactly 7 minutes, and was, in its quiet professionalism, the only part of the morning that proceeded according to anyone's prior expectations. He did not argue. He did not gather his things from the boardroom table. He stood up when the security officer named Lucas Reeves said his name. He buttoned his jacket. He did not look at Imani. He did not look at Robert Tennant. He walked toward the door. He paused once at the threshold, and he turned back briefly toward the chair he had occupied for the past 14 months. He looked at it for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he is realizing belonged to him only on loan. Then he turned. He stepped into the hallway, and he followed Lucas toward the elevators. Robert Tennant followed 2 minutes later, escorted by the second officer. He carried under his arm the printed agenda for the meeting he would not be attending. He had not put it down. Nobody had told him to put it down. He carried it with him into the elevator, and out of the building, and home to the small office on the 3rd floor of his house in Lincoln Park, where his wife would find him later that evening sitting in his desk chair with the agenda still resting on his lap, and would understand, without him having to explain it, that something irreversible had happened. The boardroom door closed behind them with a soft mechanical click. Imani Adeyemi sat at the head of the table for the first time as the formal chief executive officer of Ashcroft Capital. The chair she had been sitting in had been adjusted to her shoulder height by 3 full notches during the 7 minutes of the exit. She did not adjust it back. She looked at the people who remained. Marion Castillo, Jonas Whitmore, Adrian Chen, still standing by the credenza, the 2 members of her Meridian transition team along the wall. "Let's begin," she said. They spent the next 2 hours in that boardroom. The conversation that followed was not the conversation Marion or Jonas had expected to have that morning. It was substantive, granular, and warm in a way that took both of them by surprise. Imani asked questions they had been waiting years for someone to ask. She wanted to know which middle managers in the regional offices had been quietly carrying the firm for years without recognition. She wanted to know which clients Garrett had personally alienated, and how recoverable those relationships were. She wanted to know what Marion would have changed about the firm's risk framework if she had been given the authority. She wanted to know what Jonas's biggest unspoken concern about the firm's wealth advisory model was. Jonas talked more in those 2 hours than he had talked in some entire fiscal quarters. Marion, somewhere around the 90-minute mark, took off her suit jacket. Neither of them had done either of those things in a meeting in this room in over a decade. The video went live 31 hours later. Adrian had requested the security footage from the executive lounge and boardroom A on Tuesday afternoon. The Ashcroft Tower's compliance team had transmitted both files to Meridian's legal department within 4 hours. Imani reviewed the footage on her laptop in her hotel room that Tuesday evening. The footage showed exactly what she remembered. Garrett walking into the executive lounge. Garrett looking past her to the credenza. Garrett asking her if she was with catering. Garrett telling her to clear the room. The catering employee retreating into the service hallway. Imani walking out without speaking. The boardroom footage showed the rest. The slide on the screen. Garrett's face as he read it. Robert Tennant's hands shaking around the paper coffee cup. Marion's small, careful adjustment of her posture. Jonas's slow lift of his eyes. The legal team did not want the footage released. The communications team was split. Imani made the decision herself on Wednesday morning at 6:32 in the morning, after reading a memo from Adrian outlining the risks. She wrote 1 sentence at the bottom of the memo in her own handwriting and sent it back. "The room needs to see how it treats women like me before it knows our names." Adrian understood exactly what Imani meant. The clip went up on Ashcroft Capital's official corporate channels at 11 in the morning Central Time on Wednesday. Without commentary, without a press release, without a hashtag, It did not need any of those things. The clip that circulated most widely was 18 seconds long, Garrett's voice, dismissive and almost bored, "Clear the room. Now. We've got a meeting in 12 minutes and we don't have time for whatever this is." Then the slow pan to Imani's face by the window, calm, steady, holding in her expression that thing that was harder to look at than anger. That thing that looked like a woman who had been in this exact moment, in different clothes, in different cities, more times than any one person should have to be. 4.1 million views in the first 24 hours, 11 million by the end of the week. The hashtag Clear the Room trended for 4 consecutive days. The comments arrived in waves, first the disbelief, then the recognition, then the stories. "This happened to me at a property closing in February. This happened to my sister at her own promotion party. This happens every single week, and nobody has the cameras she had." The stories multiplied faster than the comment threads could organize them. Lana Marchetti led her Thursday evening segment with the clip on national television. Her chyron read, "COO told new black CEO to clear the room. He did not know who she was." The footage spoke with a clarity no panel discussion could improve upon. Ashcroft Capital issued a corporate statement Friday morning. It was carefully written, professionally polished, and almost immediately overshadowed by what Imani herself posted on the firm's corporate page 6 hours later. It was 3 sentences. "The values of this firm will be reflected by what we do in the next 12 months, not what we say in the next 12 days. Internal culture is not a public relations problem. It is a hearing problem, a promotion problem, an accountability problem, and a leadership problem. And Ashcroft Capital will treat it as such going forward." The post was shared 220,000 times in the first 48 hours. It was screenshotted, printed, and pinned to bulletin boards in HR offices in companies that had no connection to Ashcroft whatsoever. The professional consequences for Garrett Sinclair arrived slowly, but with a permanence that was harder to escape. He hired a personal attorney within 72 hours. He issued a statement claiming he was the victim of a corporate ambush. The statement was widely mocked. His attorney quietly withdrew it 5 days later. 2 former colleagues came forward and confirmed on the record that the behavior in the video was consistent with patterns they had personally witnessed over the course of his career. His country club asked him to resign his membership. He spent 11 months looking for a new position. He received 43 polite rejections. Robert Tennant took a position as a compliance consultant at a smaller firm in Milwaukee, reporting to a managing director 16 years his junior, who reportedly did not know who he was when his name was first submitted for the role. Marian Castillo was promoted to Chief Operating Officer 6 weeks after the boardroom meeting. She became the highest-ranking Latina executive in Ashcroft Capital's 63-year history. Jonas Whitmore remained as head of wealth advisory and retired 19 months later with a full pension and a personal recommendation letter from Imani that he kept framed in his home office. Imani moved her family to Chicago 4 months after the acquisition. She spent her first 90 days meeting one-on-one with every relationship manager across all 3 regional offices. She flew commercial. She rented her own cars. She bought her own coffee. By the end of those 90 days, she had identified 18 mid-level managers who had been quietly carrying the firm for years, and she promoted 15 of them. She raised the firm's minimum salary band by $9,000 and absorbed the cost by restructuring the executive compensation tiers that had been bloated for over a decade. Ashcroft's quarterly revenue did not drop. It did not even slow. She launched the Adeyemi Bridge initiative in her 2nd year, funding scholarships for Black and Latina students pursuing degrees in finance and corporate law across the Midwest. By the end of its 3rd year, the program had placed 69 graduates in executive track positions across the country. She did not put her name on the program in any public-facing way. She did, however, personally call every recipient on the first Monday of their freshman year and ask them 3 questions. What do you want to learn? Who do you want to become? And what do you want the world to look like after you've built whatever you decide to build? The third question was the one most of them remembered years later. The one that, more than any scholarship check, made them feel for the first time that someone with power had asked them what they thought the future should look like, and was prepared to listen to the answer. Imani gave one extended interview about the incident, almost a year later, to a long-form podcast hosted by a journalist she had known since business school. Near the end, the journalist asked her the question everyone had been waiting to hear her answer. Why did she release the footage? She thought about it for a long moment before she spoke. Because the version of me who walked into that lounge that morning, she has been walking into rooms like that her entire life. And most of the time when she gets dismissed, there's no camera, there's no signed acquisition agreement, there's no slide queued up on the screen. Most of the time, she just has to walk back out. I wanted people to see what it actually looks like when one of us has the receipts. Not because I'm special, because I'm not. I just had the receipts that day. The next woman who walks into a room like that one might not, and she deserves to be seen the same way. So here is what I want to leave you with. And I want your honest answer in the comments. Not about Imani, not about Garrett or Robert or the outcome of any of it, about the room, about the moment when the silence stretched, and the people at the table chose to say nothing, about the man who walked past her without making eye contact, and the lawyer who held the announcement back, and the colleagues who waited until they were certain who would win before they decided who they were. What would you have done? If this story moved something in you, share it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me in the comments the room you were in, the moment you remember, the one that stayed with you. I read every single one.